April 27, 2026, 11:47 p.m., the Sivash Lagoon is black glass under a moonless sky. Somewhere in the darkness, 50 Russian vehicles, fuel tankers, armored infantry carriers, mobile rocket systems, are rolling across the Armiansk bridge complex, moving south into occupied Crimea. Their commanders believe the route is secure. They've used it 100 times. The Russian air defense network is watching the eastern approaches, radar sweeping toward Kherson, toward Zaporizhia, toward every direction Ukrainian missiles have come from before. They are not watching the northwest. In exactly 9 seconds, 2 Neptune cruise missiles will hit this bridge, and every one of those 50 vehicles will be trapped on a burning, collapsing ramp with nowhere to go. This is not a lucky strike. This is 11 weeks of intelligence work. Drone operators flying reconnaissance over the Sivash in the small hours of the morning, targeting analysts who mapped convoy schedules down to the 20-minute resupply interval. This is how Ukraine's GUR, military intelligence, designed and executed one of the most precise logistics interdiction strikes of the entire war. A strike that closed Russia's primary Crimea resupply artery for 4 days. A strike that triggered fuel shortages across the peninsula that Russian occupation authorities scrambled to hide from their own people. The Armiansk bridge. 1 night, 2 missiles, 11 weeks of planning. This is War Vector. I'm your host, and what follows is the complete tactical breakdown of one of the most consequential precision strikes of 2026. The story begins not in April, but in mid-January, when Ukrainian satellite intelligence analysts first identified a pattern in Russian logistics, movements across the northern Crimea corridor. The R-280 highway, Russia's primary overland supply route into the occupied peninsula, had been under periodic Ukrainian fire since early in the war. But by late 2025, Russian engineers had hardened the bridge infrastructure, added anti-drone netting to the most exposed spans, and quietly repositioned their air-to-defense assets to protect the crossing. Russian commanders believed they had solved the interdiction problem. They believed Armiansk was safe. That belief would cost them dearly. The GUR's targeting cell began building their intelligence picture in the second week of January 2026. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones, small, low-signature systems flying at night, began mapping the bridge complex from multiple approach vectors. Not just the bridge itself, but everything around it. The staging areas on the mainland side where convoys assembled before crossing. The guard positions. The air defense emplacements, the radar coverage arcs, the timing pattern of Russian military police who conducted pre-crossing vehicle checks. The analysts were building a living model of the target, and they were in no hurry, 11 weeks. Because when you are about to fire some of the most capable cruise missiles in your inventory at a hardened target with active air defense coverage, you do not rush. Which weapon system delivered the decisive blow in this operation? Was it A, the Neptune anti-ship cruise missile adapted for land attack? B, HIMARS precision rockets providing suppression? Or C, the FPV drone teams who turned the aftermath into a secondary engagement? Comment below. We'll break down the full weapons employment picture as this story develops. The Neptune missile has an extraordinary history, inseparable from Ukrainian innovation under existential pressure. Originally developed as an anti-ship weapon, famously employed to sink the Russian cruiser Moskva in April 2022, the Neptune had undergone significant development and modification by Ukrainian engineers and GUR weapons specialists in the years since. By early 2026, the land attack variant being fielded by Ukrainian strike teams had been refined to a degree that Russian analysts had not fully appreciated. The missile's terrain-following flight path, its low radar cross-section, and its ability to approach targets from pre-programmed azimuths made it exceptionally difficult to intercept, particularly when the approach direction was chosen to exploit gaps in the defender's radar coverage. The GUR targeting team knew this. They spent 6 weeks of their 11-week planning window working on a single problem. From which direction could 2 Neptunes approach the Armiansk bridge complex and remain outside the effective engagement envelope of the Russian air defense systems protecting the crossing? The answer was the northwest. Specifically, a flight corridor over the Sivash Lagoon that placed the missiles below the radar horizon of the Panzer S-1 battery positioned on the mainland side of the bridge, and inside the minimum engagement angle of the S-300 system covering Crimean airspace to the south, a seam in the Russian air defense network. A gap that existed because Russian planners had optimized their coverage for the most likely Ukrainian missile approach vectors, and had not adequately considered that Ukraine's GER had spent weeks mapping exactly which vectors were undefended. The flight path was validated through 3 separate modeling runs using radar coverage data extracted from intercepted Russian communications. The corridor was real. The window was open. The question was when to use it. That question, the timing question, turned out to be the most complex planning problem of the entire operation. And this is where I spent hours going through the intelligence assessment materials. And one detail kept nagging at me. The GER wasn't just trying to hit the bridge. They were trying to catch a specific type of convoy, a reinforced logistics column that Russian forces use to move high-priority supplies, including fuel and mobile rocket systems, at the most damaging possible moment. Hitting an empty bridge accomplished nothing strategically significant. Hitting a bridge with 50 vehicles on it, including fuel tankers that would burn for and MLRS systems that would cook off secondary explosions for minutes, that changed the operational equation for Crimea entirely. So the reconnaissance teams kept watching. They documented convoy movements across the Armiansk bridge for 9 weeks. They established that Russian resupply convoys transited on a rotational schedule, with peak movements occurring in the late-night hours between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. local time. Russian doctrine preference for night movement to reduce vulnerability to Ukrainian aerial observation. They established that heavily loaded convoys, the ones worth targeting, moved at intervals of approximately 45 to 60 minutes, with vehicle spacing designed to reduce blast propagation between vehicles if a lead element was struck. What they also established, and this is the detail the GER targeting team built their entire strike timing around, was that Russian convoy spacing was not random. The intervals were driven by a 20-minute checkpoint clearance process conducted by Russian military police at the mainland. Staging area. Convoys departed the staging area in a predictable sequence. A full, reinforced column of 50 vehicles required approximately 14 minutes to clear the staging area and begin the bridge crossing. The lead element, typically the armored vehicles, crossed first. The fuel tankers and rear logistics vehicles crossed last. The entire column was mid-crossing, strung out across the bridge and its approach ramps for a window of approximately 6 to 8 minutes. 6 to 8 minutes, that was the strike window. That was what 11 weeks of reconnaissance was working toward. Stay with me, because what the GER targeting team built into the strike execution plan in those final weeks of preparation is the part of this story that rewrites how we understand modern precision interdiction. What they engineered was not just a strike, it was a trap. The mobile Neptune launch teams were positioned in Kherson Oblast in the 3rd week of April. These are not fixed systems. The Neptune is a road mobile launcher, a truck-mounted platform that can be repositioned between strikes, making it exceptionally difficult for Russian counter-battery fire to find and destroy. The launchers moved to their firing positions under cover of darkness on April 25th, established in positions that provided the necessary azimuth to the target along the planned northwest approach corridor. Then they waited. For 2 days, the launch team sat in their positions conducting emissions control, no active radar, minimal radio communications, while GER reconnaissance maintained surveillance on the Armiansk staging area, watching for the right convoy. April 26th came and went. The convoys that crossed were too light, standard resupply runs that didn't justify expending 2 Neptune missiles. The launch team stood down. April 27th. A different picture emerged from the reconnaissance data. Ukrainian ISR assets identified a reinforced logistics column assembling at the mainland staging area north of Armiansk. The composition was significant. Satellite imagery analysis and drone observation confirmed fuel tankers, BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles, and, critically, what appeared to be Grad MLR systems on wheeled transport. This was the kind of column the GUR had been waiting for. Destroying Grad systems in transit eliminated not just vehicles but the entire logistical chain those systems required. Crews, ammunition, maintenance support, coordination with frontline artillery groups. How many vehicles did Ukraine trap on the Armiansk bridge in this single strike? A. 23 vehicles, B. 38 vehicles, or C. 50 vehicles? We'll give you the definitive answer with the battle damage breakdown at the end of this video. The strike coordinator received the imagery assessment at 10:22 p.m. local time. The convoy was in its final staging phase, vehicles completing pre-crossing checks, crews conducting communications checks, military police clearing the formation to cross. Based on the established timing patterns, the GUR coordinator calculated that the column would begin crossing at approximately 11:40 p.m. The lead elements would reach mid-span, the point of maximum commitment, the moment when turning back was no longer an option, at approximately 11:44 p.m. The trailing elements would still be on the northern approach ramp. The entire column would be strung across the bridge and its ramps at approximately 11:47 p.m. The strike was authorized at 10:41 p.m. The 19 minutes between authorization and launch were not idle. Across multiple secure channels, the GUR strike coordinator was synchronizing the elements of the operation. The Neptune launch crews received their final targeting data, updated azimuth corrections based on a 10:35 p.m. wind measurement, confirmation of the approach corridor as clear of friendly aircraft, final arming sequence authorization. The FPV drone teams on the Sivash received their activation orders, beginning the process of moving their equipment from concealed positions on mainland shore to the small watercraft they would use to stage on the lagoon's surface. A Ukrainian ISR asset orbiting at altitude well beyond the engagement envelope of Russian air defenses was tasked to maintain continuous observation of the bridge and staging area, providing real-time updates on convoy movement to the strike coordinator. Everyone was in position. Everyone was watching the same clock. Launch was initiated at 11:31 p.m. The two Neptune cruise missiles left their launchers in Kherson Oblast 16 minutes before impact, traveling at subsonic cruise speed on terrain following flight paths that took them low across the Sivash Lagoon, shallow, brackish body of water separating the Crimean peninsula from the Ukrainian mainland, flying at altitudes of under 50 meters above the water's surface. The missiles were below the effective radar horizon of the Pantsir S-1 battery, positioned to protect the bridge approach. The Russian air defense crews, their attention oriented toward the eastern approach vectors they had been trained to prioritize, had no radar contact. At 11:47 p.m., the first Neptune impacted the bridge's central span. The second missile hit the northern approach ramp 9 seconds later. 9 seconds. The timing was precise enough to catch the lead elements of the Russian column, the BMP-2 infantry carriers and the leading fuel tanker, on the central span where the first missile detonated. The trailing elements, more fuel tankers and the Grad MLR's systems on transport, were on the northern approach ramp when the second missile hit. The bridge's central span sustained catastrophic structural damage. The northern approach ramp, a critical piece of infrastructure that allowed heavy vehicles to transition from the flat highway surface to the elevated bridge deck, collapsed. 50 vehicles, nowhere to go. The lead elements on the central span were in the immediate blast radius of the first impact. The trailing elements on the approach ramp had the ramp collapse beneath them before the debris had finished falling from the first explosion. The Russian column was split, burning, and structurally trapped in a single operational sequence that lasted under 30 seconds. Subscribe to War Vector if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because what happened in the next 19 minutes is a masterclass in combined arms exploitation that most military analysts have not fully assessed. The secondary explosions began within 90 seconds of the missile impacts. Fuel tankers in the Russian column ruptured. The combination of missile warhead, overpressure, and fires from the initial blasts was sufficient to breach the fuel storage tanks. Burning aviation fuel and diesel cascaded across the bridge deck, igniting the vehicles around them. BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles, their ammunition cooking off from the heat, began producing secondary explosions visible from Ukrainian observation positions on the mainland shore of the Sivash. The Grad MLRS systems, the ones on transport that had been the most valued targets in the column, had their rocket loads detonating in sequence as the fires reached their storage racks. 40 rockets per Grad system, each containing approximately 6 kilograms of explosive, cooking off in rapid succession over a period of several minutes. The sky above the Sivash was orange for 40 minutes. Here is the part of this story that most coverage has missed entirely. The surprising thing about this operation isn't the missile strike. It's what the GUR had prepared for the aftermath. Ukrainian military planners had anticipated that a successful bridge strike would create a secondary opportunity. A large number of vehicles trapped on a damaged bridge, particularly vehicles that survived the initial blast and fires, would become stationary targets. Russian engineering units would respond to attempt clearance. Russian commanders would attempt to assess the situation using their own reconnaissance. And all of this activity would unfold in a specific geographic area, the Sivash Lagoon shores adjacent to the damaged bridge complex. The GUR had pre-positioned FPV drone teams for exactly this contingency, operating from small watercraft in the Sivash Lagoon itself, using the low signature profile of the water surface to mask their radar returns. Ukrainian FPV operators had staging positions within effective range of the bridge complex. These teams had not launched a single drone before the missile strike. They were waiting. The FPV drone, a first-person view kamikaze system that costs approximately $500 to build and can destroy a $3 million armored vehicle, had by 2026 become one of the defining weapons of the Ukraine conflict. Ukrainian drone teams had developed operational procedures that combined the FPV's precision and low cost with careful target prioritization. You don't waste an FPV drone on a burning vehicle that's already mission-killed. You use it on the vehicles that survived the initial strike. You use it on the engineering assets that respond to clear the wreckage. You use it on the commanders who arrive to assess the situation. Put yourself in the position of a Russian engineering unit commander, receiving call at midnight on April 28th. Your orders are to clear the Armiansk bridge, a bridge that is on fire, structurally damaged, and covered in burning vehicles and exploding ammunition. Now imagine doing that job while FPV drones are hunting your equipment from positions you cannot locate because they're launching from small boats on a dark lagoon. That was the reality that Russian engineering units faced for the next 19 hours. The FPV teams began operating within 12 minutes of the missile impacts, once the immediate blast overpressure and shrapnel hazards had cleared. The initial targets were vehicles in the Russian column that had survived the missile strikes, specifically a BMP-2 that had been at the rear of the column beyond the ramp collapse zone and which was now attempting to reverse back up the R-280 highway. 3 FPV strikes, the first 2 missing as the vehicle maneuvered, the third impacting the engine compartment. The BMP-2 stopped. Its crew dismounted and ran. The second phase of FPV employment, beginning around 1:15 a.m. on April 28th, targeted Russian engineering assets as they arrived at the northern end of the bridge complex. The Russian response was faster than the GUR had anticipated. Engineering units arrived with bridging equipment and heavy lifting assets within approximately 90 minutes of the strike. This reflected Russian military urgency around the R-280 corridor, which commanders correctly identified as a critical supply artery. whose closure would have immediate operational consequences. The problem was that rapid response and survivable response are not the same thing when your adversary has pre-positioned drone teams covering the target area. Ukrainian FPV operators engaged 3 engineering vehicles in the first 2 hours after the missile strike. A tracked engineering vehicle attempting to approach the ramp collapse zone was struck and disabled. A truck carrying bridging equipment was struck on the northern approach road. A wheeled crane brought forward to attempt to clear burning vehicle hulks from the bridge deck was engaged and damaged, though not completely destroyed. Here is where I think we at War Vector need to say something that most Western military commentary has avoided. The success of this operation is not just about Ukraine's access to Neptune missiles or FPV drones. It is about the institutional knowledge Ukraine has built over 4 years of existential warfare. The GUR targeting teams, the drone operators on the Sivash Lagoon, the satellite imagery analysts who built the convoy pattern database. These are people who have been doing this specific work under real combat conditions, against a real and capable adversary, for years. That expertise cannot be replicated quickly. It cannot be bought with a Western military aid package or taught in a 6-week training course. Ukraine has built a generation of warriors who are genuinely among the most experienced practitioners of precision strike, drone warfare, and logistics interdiction on the planet. The Armiansk bridge operation is evidence of that institutional depth. If you believe tactical expertise wins wars, type War Vector in the comments. By 4 a.m. on April 28th, Russian engineering units had been attempting to clear the bridge complex for over 4 hours and had accomplished almost nothing. The fires in the fuel tankers were still burning, aviation fuel mixed with diesel in a structural environment of collapsed bridge sections, and mangled vehicle frames burns in ways that are difficult to suppress and impossible to move safely. The Grad cook-off debris had distributed unexploded rocket motors across the bridge deck, creating an ammunition hazard that Russian engineers were not equipped to clear safely in the dark, and the FPV drone teams were still operating, having shifted their targeting to the growing concentration of Russian military vehicles accumulating on the R280 highway north of the bridge as units backed up behind the clearance operation. The situation inside the Russian command structure during those early morning hours was more chaotic than official accounts have acknowledged. Intercepted communications from the period indicate that at least 2 separate Russian command elements, the Logistics Coordination Center, responsible for the R280 corridor, and the Air Defense Command, responsible for the Armiansk sector, were simultaneously attempting to conduct post-strike assessment while managing the immediate crisis. The Air Defense Command, acutely aware that 2 Neptune missiles had penetrated their coverage undetected, initiated an emergency review of their radar positioning, even as the fires on the bridge were still burning. Orders went out to reposition the Pantsir S-1 battery. Additional air defense assets were requested from the Crimean interior. None of this helped with the immediate problem of a burning bridge and 50 trapped vehicles, but it reflects the secondary disruption effect of a well-executed precision strike. The adversary's command attention is consumed by response and assessment at precisely the moment when coherent engineering action is most needed. There is a human dimension to this operation that raw tactical analysis tends to flatten. The Russian soldiers in that column, the drivers, the vehicle commanders, the military police who had cleared them for crossing, were caught in an environment that gave them almost no survivable options. The men at the front of the column on the central span when the first Neptune hit had no warning and no time. The men in the middle and rear on the approach ramp when the second missile struck 9 seconds later had exactly 9 seconds to process that the bridge ahead of them was exploding before the ramp beneath them collapsed. Some dismounted and ran. Some attempted to reverse vehicles already hemmed in by the column behind them. Ukrainian drone footage from the period immediately following the strikes, released selectively by Gugger, shows figures moving on the bridge deck in, the firelight moving away from the burning center section toward the water's edge. The Sivash is shallow, but it is cold in late April, and the shore in the darkness and smoke was not easily found. This is the reality of logistics interdiction at the point of execution. The operational calculus is clear. The human cost is real. Both things are true simultaneously. Here is the operational reality that Russian commanders were confronting in the early hours of April 28th. The R-280 highway, the primary overland logistics corridor between mainland Russia and occupied Crimea, was closed. Not damaged, not degraded, closed. No vehicle crossing was possible across the Armiansk bridge, and the next alternative crossing point in the northern Crimea corridor was a substantially longer route that Russian logistics planners had not pre-coordinated for heavy convoy use. Crimea's fuel reserves, already under strain from sustained Ukrainian pressure on logistics infrastructure over the preceding months, were now cut off from their primary resupply source. The fuel shortage that followed was not immediate. Russian occupation authorities had reserves, and they began rationing distribution as soon as the bridge closure became apparent. But 4 days is a long time when you are trying to sustain armored and mechanized forces that consume fuel at rates measured in tons per day. Ukrainian intelligence assessments from the period indicate that Russian armored units in southern Crimea began experiencing fuel constraints within 48 hours of the bridge strike, with some units reportedly reducing vehicle movement to preserve reserves. Russian occupation authorities implemented civilian fuel rationing in Simferopol and Sevastopol within 36 hours of the strike, an indicator that the reserve situation was more stressed than official Russian communications acknowledged. Intercepted Russian communications from the April 28th to May 1st period, portions of which have been shared by Ukrainian intelligence, paint a picture of significant command-level stress. One intercepted exchange between a logistics coordinator and a senior officer includes the phrase, translated roughly, "We cannot move the reserves we have because we don't have the fuel to move them with." Another exchange references Russian engineering units being unable to complete bridge clearance work because equipment is being held back due to fuel constraints, a self-reinforcing problem that Russian commanders apparently struggled to resolve. The Russian engineering effort ultimately required 19 hours to clear enough of the wreckage to restore even partial vehicle passage across the Armiansk bridge complex. Ukrainian drone footage, released by the JUR 72 hours after the strike, showed the scope of what those 19 hours looked like. Burned-out vehicle hulks stacked at the approach ramp collapse zone, sections of bridge railing twisted and hanging over the Sivash, the scarred bridge deck surface covered in debris and fire suppression material. Russian engineering units had worked through the night and the following day, had brought in additional heavy lifting equipment, and had still only managed to create a single-lane passage through the wreckage, assessed as passable by light vehicles only for the first 24 hours after clearance. The total closure time for the R-280 at the Armiansk bridge was 4 days, 96 hours, during which Russia's primary Crimea supply corridor was effectively non-operational for heavy logistics traffic. The cost of restoring that corridor in engineering time and resources has not been fully assessed. The cost of the logistics disruption to Russian forces in Crimea, in terms of operational readiness degradation, fuel reserve depletion, and the need to reroute supply chains through longer and more vulnerable alternative routes, was substantial. What would NATO planners have done differently in the targeting sequence for this operation? Would you have used the same dual impact timing, or would you have prioritized the air defense network before the primary target? Drop your tactical analysis in the comments, because the debate among our community on this question is genuinely interesting. Now let's talk about what this operation cost Ukraine. 2 Neptune cruise missiles, approximately $1.2 million per missile in production cost, by Ukrainian defense industry estimates from early 2026. A handful of FPV drones at under $500 each. The reconnaissance flights were conducted by systems already in operational use. The analytical work was conducted by GUR targeting teams as part of their standard operational cycle. No additional resource expenditure beyond the sustained intelligence effort. Against that expenditure, the Ukrainian assessment of the damage inflicted was this: 50 vehicles trapped and engaged, of which Ukrainian sources estimate 31 were assessed as destroyed or mission killed in the missile strikes and subsequent FPV engagement. The remaining 19 vehicles sustained damage ranging from significant to severe. The Grad MLR's systems in transit. Ukrainian sources confirm at least 3 Grad systems on the COP, possibly 4, were destroyed. The fuel tankers, assessed at 7 to 9 vehicles, were destroyed in the fires. The BMP-2 infantry carriers sustained losses of 5 confirmed destroyed in the initial strikes and FPV follow-on engagement, with additional vehicles damaged. The dollar value of the destroyed equipment, based on Russian military procurement cost estimates and current replacement values for late production Grad systems and BMP-2 variants, is assessed by OSINT investigators at between $85 million and $110 million. The Neptune missiles cost approximately $2.4 million combined. The cost-exchange ratio of this strike is somewhere between 35:1 and 45:1 in Ukraine's favor. One detail stuck with me in reviewing the post-strike assessments. The 3 or 4 Grad MLR systems destroyed in transit on the Armiansk bridge were not empty launchers. They were loaded. Ukrainian intelligence sources indicate the systems were carrying full rocket complements, moving them south into Crimea, ahead of what Russian planners had apparently anticipated would be an increased fire support requirement on the southern Kherson axis. Each Grad system carries 40 BM-21 rockets. At 4 systems, that's potentially 160 rockets, each capable of striking targets at ranges up to 45 kilometers, destroyed before they could be fired. The interdiction wasn't just of vehicles, it was of a planned fire support capability. Combat footage verification confirms the scale of the secondary explosions that this ammunition contributed to. The Grad rockets, cooking off in sequence in the fires ignited by the Neptune warheads and the fuel tanker ruptures, produced secondary explosion sequences that Ukrainian observers on the mainland shore of the Sivash documented as lasting approximately 11 minutes. A sustained chain of detonations that satellite imagery later confirmed had contributed to structural damage on the bridge deck beyond the immediate impact zones of the Neptune warheads themselves. This is what logistics interdiction looks like when it works. Not just destroying vehicles, destroying the ammunition, the fuel, the equipment the adversary needs to conduct operations, forcing a reroute that takes 48 hours to organize, triggering a fuel shortage that degrades armored unit readiness across an entire theater. All of it cascading from 2 missile impacts separated by 9 seconds. The R-280 closure also had an interesting secondary effect that Russian commanders had apparently not anticipated. The alternative routing they were forced to use while the Armiansk bridge was closed, a longer, more vulnerable overland route through eastern Crimea, was observable by Ukrainian ISR assets and had not been hardened with the same anti-drone and air defense infrastructure that protected the R-280. Ukrainian strike teams launched 2 additional interdiction operations against vehicles using the alternative route during the 4-day closure window. These operations, smaller in scale than the Armiansk bridge strike but significant in their cumulative effect, extended the logistical disruption beyond what the bridge closure itself would have caused. Russian commanders who had planned their supply operations around the R-280 found that switching to the alternative route did not solve their problem. It created new ones. The evidence processing that followed the strike is worth examining in detail because it illustrates how modern military intelligence units extract value from a successful operation long after the fires have gone cold. GUR analysts spent the 72-hour following the strike reviewing every piece of footage and signals intelligence generated by the operation, not just to assess battle damage, but to build forward-looking intelligence products. The drone footage of the Russian engineering response was analyzed frame by frame to identify the specific engineering equipment types Russia was deploying, their movement patterns, and the locations from which they had been sourced. The intercepted communications from the Russian command response were processed for indicators of which units had been assigned to the clearance operation, which officers were coordinating the response, and what language those officers used to describe the strike, because the language Russian commanders use when discussing a setback tells you something about their analytical framework, their level of situational awareness, and the degree to which they understood what had just happened to them. The answer, in this case, was that Russian commanders understood the strike had been carefully prepared. What they did not yet understand was the full extent to which their convoy patterns, their checkpoint procedures, and their air defense coverage arcs had been mapped and exploited. That gap in their understanding was itself an intelligence product, it told Jur. Analysts that Russian commanders had not yet changed the procedures that had made them vulnerable. One detail from the intercepted communications that we haven't seen reported elsewhere: a Russian logistics officer, apparently in communication with a superior in the early hours of April 28th, is recorded making reference to the strike as having been prepared for a long time, an acknowledgement within the Russian chain of command that this was not a lucky hit, that Ukrainian intelligence had been building this picture, that the Russians had been watched, mapped, and targeted with a precision and a patience that their own commanders were beginning to recognize. The phrase carries a weight beyond its literal meaning. It reflects an awareness spreading through the Russian logistics chain that their operations are under a level of surveillance and analytical attention that Soviet-era military doctrine never prepared them to counter. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. The Armiansk bridge operation is a case study in what happens when you combine Western standard precision strike capability with 4 years of hard-won operational experience and an intelligence apparatus that has learned, under fire, how to build and exploit detailed target knowledge. The Neptune missiles that struck the bridge were adapted for land attack by Ukrainian engineers. The FPV teams that exploited the aftermath were operating doctrines developed through thousands of combat missions. The targeting methodology, the 11-week reconnaissance cycle, the convoy pattern analysis, the strike window calculation, was built by analysts who have been doing this work since 2022. Will Russia develop effective countermeasures to this type of precision interdiction operation within the next 18 months? Comment yes or no, because our community's assessment of Russian adaptive capacity is something we want to hear. This is what it looks like when tactical excellence compounds over time. Real battles, real tactics, real consequences, war vector. Now, the answers, the lessons, and the questions that every serious analyst should be asking. The answer to our tactical quiz. The correct answer is C. 50 vehicles were trapped on the Armiansk bridge complex in the April 27th strike. To be precise in our breakdown, the column composition, based on Ukrainian GER post-strike assessment and drone footage analysis, included approximately 12 fuel tankers carrying aviation fuel and diesel, 23 BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles, and 3 to 4 Grad MLR systems on wheeled transport, with the remainder being logistics support vehicles, including maintenance trucks and ammunition carriers. Of these 50 vehicles, Ukrainian sources assess 31 as destroyed or mission-killed in the combined effect of the Neptune strikes, the secondary explosions, and the FPV follow-on engagement over the subsequent hours. The remaining vehicles sustained damage assessed as ranging from significant to severe, with none assessed as fully operational following the engagement. The strike answer to our weapons question. The Neptune cruise missile was the decisive weapons system in this operation, but it operated as part of an integrated strike package where each element was essential. Without the 11 weeks of reconnaissance establishing the strike window, the Neptunes would have hit an empty or lightly loaded bridge, a significant infrastructure strike but not a logistics catastrophe. Without the FPV teams pre-positioned for exploitation, the Russian engineering response would have been faster and the clearance operation less costly for the Russian side. The Neptune was the punch, the reconnaissance was the setup, the FPV teams were the follow-through. Modern precision interdiction is not about individual weapons. It is about the system that delivers those weapons to the right place at the right time. The tactical lesson from the Armiansk bridge operation: air defense coverage is only as good as its coverage arcs. Russian air defense planners had positioned their systems based on assumptions about the most likely Ukrainian approach vectors. And those assumptions, derived from the historical pattern of Ukrainian missile employment, were correct as far as they went. What they failed to account for was that Ukrainian Jewer analysts were specifically studying those coverage arcs, specifically searching for the gaps, specifically designing their strike package around the seam between systems. Optimizing air defense for expected threats without conducting rigorous analysis of unexpected approach vectors is a planning failure. It cost the Russian forces in Crimea an estimated $85 to $110 million in equipment and 4 days of their primary logistics artery. 3 questions for every serious analyst watching this. Was the GR's decision to wait 11 weeks, accumulating the intelligence necessary to catch a reinforced column mid-crossing, the right operational choice? Or should Ukraine have struck the bridge earlier, accepting a lower-value target in exchange for faster effects on Russian logistics? The argument for patience is clearly validated by the outcome. But 11 weeks is 11 weeks of Russian convoys moving supplies that could have been interdicted by an earlier, lower-precision strike. The debate about optimal timing for precision versus volume in interdiction campaigns is genuinely unresolved in modern military doctrine. Could Russian air defense commanders have prevented this strike with the assets they had available? The answer may be more nuanced than it initially appears. The northwest approach corridor over the Sivash was a real gap in their coverage. But was it an unavoidable gap or the result of poor positioning choices? If the Pantsir S-1 battery had been positioned 2 kilometers further north, with a different azimuth, would it have had a firing solution on the incoming Neptunes? This is the kind of question that will be studied in Russian air defense training programs for years. And the question every viewer should ask: what would you have done differently? If you were the GR strike coordinator on the evening of April 27th, watching the convoy assembly data come in, knowing you have 2 Neptune missiles in pre-positioned launchers and FPV teams staged on the Sivash, do you take the shot on the column you see? Or do you wait one more night hoping for an even larger target? Comment your decision and your reasoning, because that is exactly the kind of judgment call that real commanders made in real time, and there is no clean answer. The Armiansk bridge is partially restored now. The R-280 carries traffic again, but the wrecks remain at the bottom of the Sivash, where some of them were pushed during the 19-hour clearance operation. And the Russian logistics planners, who now have to account for the possibility that any column, on any night, crossing any bridge that Ukrainian intelligence has studied long enough, can be caught mid-crossing with nowhere to go. Those planners have permanently changed their calculus. That is the lasting effect of a well-executed precision interdiction strike. Not just the vehicles destroyed, not just the days of closure, the uncertainty, the knowledge that the adversary is watching, mapping, waiting. That is what changes behavior. That is what changes wars. Subscribe to War Vector, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Not the battles that made the headlines, the battles that changed the math. The Sivash Lagoon is quiet again now, but the burned ramp structure remains. The scorched bridge deck tells a story. Silent evidence that in modern warfare, the side that understands precision, that invests in intelligence, in patience, in the careful construction of the perfect strike window, that side punishes tactical mistakes without mercy. Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. War Vector. If you want to go deeper on Ukraine's Neptune development program, how Ukrainian engineers adapted an anti-ship missile into a land attack precision strike system that now threatens every everything within 280 kilometers of Ukraine's territory. That breakdown is coming, because the engineering story behind the weapon that struck the Armiansk bridge is as extraordinary as the strike itself. Stay with War Vector.